When I saw the cruise photos splashed across Facebook, my heart stopped. My parents, the very people I had emptied my savings account to help, were smiling on a sunlit deck, drinks in hand, their arms around relatives who never lifted a finger. I blinked, refreshing the page, hoping it was some mistake, a dream maybe, but no. Every image was a dagger. My parents laughing, celebrating, while I sat alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Cleveland, drowning in overdue bills, convinced my sacrifice was keeping my father alive. The betrayal was almost cinematic in its cruelty, and as my breath quickened, I felt my body burn with a rage I had never known. At that moment, one thought echoed through my head. I wasn't just forgotten. I was discarded like trash. And that night, staring at those glowing screens, I decided something inside me would break forever. My name is Karina Harlow. I'm 36 years old. And until that moment, I thought I was a good daughter. I was the one who worked double shifts at the diner, picked up weekend catering gigs, and sold my grandmother's heirloom bracelet just to scrape together money when they told me Dad's medical bills were piling up. I was the one who skipped Christmas dinners because I couldn't afford gas to drive home. My life had been a marathon of sacrifice, but I told myself it was worth it because family always came first. That was my mantra, the thread I clung to whenever exhaustion threatened to break me. But staring at those vacation snapshots, I realized something horrifying. Maybe family didn't mean the same thing to them as it did to me. Maybe love for them was a performance, while loyalty for me was a prison. I never grew up with much. Our house in Akron was modest, a beige two-story with a sagging porch, but I loved it. I loved the way Mom's cinnamon rolls filled the hallways on Sundays, and how Dad used to whistle while mowing the lawn. Those memories carried me through dark times, through heartbreaks, through my own failed marriage at 28. I thought those images meant something sacred, proof that my parents and I were bound by something unshakable. But when I scrolled through their smiling faces on that Caribbean cruise, those childhood memories felt tainted, like old photographs burned at the edges. How could the same people who taught me about honesty and sacrifice lie so easily, steal so coldly, and celebrate so loudly while I struggled to breathe under the weight of debt? The lie began with a single phone call. Mom's voice was trembling, urgent. She said Dad's medical bills had come due, and they didn't have enough to cover them. Insurance was dragging its feet. Hospitals were threatening collection, and she begged me, her sweet Karina, to step in. I didn't hesitate. I wired them $2,800 that afternoon. It wasn't easy. That was my emergency fund, the small cushion I built after years of scraping by. It was the money I planned to use to finally fix my car's transmission, or maybe just take a break from the endless grind of working. But I gave it away without question, because when your parents call you crying, you don't think twice. That's what I believed. That's what I had always believed, until I learned it was all a lie. At first, I doubted myself. Maybe the cruise was gifted by someone else. Maybe it was some work perk from Mom's office. I wanted so desperately to believe there was an explanation, one that didn't involve betrayal. But then I saw the captions. So glad we could use Karina's help to finally take this trip. My aunt had posted it, tagging my parents, laughing about how young people never understand how much older folks need to enjoy life. My knees gave out. My own blood had turned me into the punchline of a family joke. I was the fool who gave, the fool who sacrificed, while they toasted champagne on a luxury liner. That night, I called my mother. My voice was shaking, but hers was calm, almost annoyed, as if I had interrupted her peace. She admitted it without hesitation. Karina, your father's fine. We needed a break. You don't understand what it's like to get older. We earned this. I couldn't breathe. Every syllable felt like venom. My money hadn't gone to keep Dad alive. It went to pina coladas and shuffleboard. She laughed when I asked how she could do this to me. Sweetheart, don't be so dramatic. It's just money. Just money? The words echoed in my head like gunshots. Just money had been my survival, my hope, my security. For them, it was just tickets to paradise. I lay awake for nights afterward, replaying that call. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in, every creak of the radiator mocking me for being naive. I thought about my childhood, about the times I missed school trips because we couldn't afford it. I thought about how Dad refused to buy me a prom dress, telling me to be grateful for what you have. Now, with cruel irony, they used my sacrifices to live the very life they had denied me. The rage inside me was no longer a flame. It was wildfire. It consumed me every time I closed my eyes, and in its smoke, a thought began to take shape, a thought that terrified me at first, but grew louder each day. Maybe they weren't going to get away with this. Maybe for the first time in my life, I would stop being the good daughter. I didn't know what revenge meant yet. All I knew was that the ground beneath my world had cracked, and the only way to survive was to let the darkness in. I began to write everything down, every memory of their lies, every manipulation. I scribbled until my hands ached, pages filled with anger and betrayal. It was my therapy, but it was also my blueprint. Because revenge, I realized, isn't just about punishment. It's about reclaiming power that was stolen. And that night, as the sound of laughter from my neighbor's apartment echoed through the thin walls, I whispered to myself, they'll regret this. By the end of that week, I was no longer the same woman. I was no longer the tired waitress who said yes to everyone. I had become someone sharper, someone dangerous. They had underestimated me, and soon they would learn that my silence had only been a mask. The cruise had ended, but my storm was just beginning. And if you're here listening to my story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about family. When I was 9 years old, I learned that my needs came last. It was the night of the school talent show. I had begged my mom to buy me a simple red dress I saw on clearance at the local mall, something that made me feel like I belonged on that stage with the other girls. But when the evening came, I stood in the cafeteria under the harsh fluorescent lights wearing a faded hand-me-down sweater with a hole in the sleeve. My mother had told me, "Karina, clothes don't matter. What matters is saving money." I tried to believe her, tried to smile as I sang my little song in front of the crowd, but when I looked out and saw her laughing with neighbors, instead of watching me, I realized the truth. Clothes weren't the problem. I was. My happiness was never a priority in that house. That night etched itself into me like a scar. I remembered Dad scolding me on the drive home when I cried quietly in the back seat. "Stop being ungrateful, Karina. We're doing the best we can." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I'd seen Mom's new jewelry box earlier that week, a sparkling necklace she claimed was from a friend. I'd heard Dad bragging to his buddies about poker games he'd played when he was supposed to be working overtime. Even at 9 years old, I understood something was broken in our family. They had money for themselves, always, just not for me. And as I stared at the passing streetlights, I promised myself I'd never need anyone, that I would earn everything with my own 2 hands. It was the first vow I ever made, and the one that would come back to haunt me. In high school, I became the dependable one, the child who never asked for rides, who worked part-time at the corner grocery to pay for her own sneakers, who volunteered to stay home when the family went out to eat because someone had to watch the dog. My parents praised me for being mature, but their compliments tasted like poison. I wasn't mature. I was ignored. I saw my older brother, Mark, get handed keys to a used car for his 17th birthday, while I was told to ride the bus. I saw my younger sister, Elise, get a $200 prom dress without question, while I was told to be creative and sew my own. And each time I swallowed the resentment, each time I plastered on a smile, I dug myself deeper into the role they carved for me. The invisible daughter. The one who gave but never received. The cruelty of it all is that I believed it was love. I convinced myself that by sacrificing, by never complaining, I was proving my worth. That if I just kept giving, eventually they would see me, appreciate me, love me the way I loved them. But the years stretched on, and that moment never came. Instead, they leaned harder. Mom would borrow money for groceries, and then come home with bags of new makeup. Dad would ask me to help out with gas, even when I didn't have enough for my own bus fare. It was always the same story. Karina, the responsible one, the steady one, the one who could be leaned on. And I played along because I thought that was what daughters were supposed to do. By the time I graduated high school, I had saved enough for community college. I was proud of myself, glowing as I held my acceptance letter. But when tuition came due, Mom sat me down at the kitchen table with tears in her eyes. Karina, your father and I just can't make ends meet this month. Could you use that money to help us instead? You can always go to school later. I remember staring at her, my chest tight, the words catching in my throat. But then she touched my hand and whispered, "You're such a good girl. Your siblings could never handle this responsibility." And just like that, I handed over my future. College slipped away, and I told myself it was temporary. But temporary turned into forever. And that's how I found myself waitressing at 36, still their safety net, still their fool. The irony is that outside of my family, people admired me. Customers at the diner called me kind. Friends praised my loyalty. Even boyfriends said I had a good heart. But that good heart always got broken, especially by the people I trusted most. When my marriage ended, it wasn't because of infidelity or abuse. It was because my husband, Carter, told me flat out, "I can't compete with your family. You give them everything and leave nothing for us." I had cried for weeks after he left, but even then, I didn't stop. When Mom called asking for help with her car repairs, I sent money. When Dad complained about debt collectors, I took out a payday loan just to cover him. I thought if I just kept giving, one day I'd be enough. But looking back now, I see how foolish I was. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a bank. It wasn't until that cruise betrayal that everything snapped into focus. All the childhood sacrifices, the missed opportunities, the money siphoned from my life. It led to that moment, staring at pictures of my family celebrating without me. That was the culmination of decades of using me. And suddenly, I saw it all so clearly. I was never invisible to them. I was never forgotten. No, they remembered me perfectly. They remembered that I was the one who wouldn't say no, the one who would always bleed, so they could dance. I wasn't invisible. I was their weapon. And that realization twisted something deep in my chest, something I could never untwist. As I sat with those memories, my anger curdled into something sharper, something dangerous. I began to wonder if maybe this was always their plan. Maybe my whole childhood was designed to shape me into this selfless fool, this obedient servant. Maybe every guilt trip, every manipulation, every backhanded compliment was part of the conditioning. And if that was true, then I wasn't just betrayed. I was groomed into sacrificing everything for them. And now, they were celebrating the spoils of my captivity on a sun-drenched deck while I ate canned soup in a cold apartment. That thought made my blood run cold. And in that moment, I stopped asking why. Instead, I started asking how I could take it all back. I didn't know it then, but the seed of revenge was already blooming inside me, a dark flower twisting upward, demanding light. I stopped thinking like a daughter. I started thinking like someone who had been robbed, beaten down, mocked, and betrayed. I started thinking like someone who wanted justice. And justice, for me, meant one thing: making them feel the weight of everything they had stolen. Making them regret the day they ever underestimated me. That's where the Real story begins. And if you think the cruise was the height of their betrayal, wait until you see what I did in return. I began small, like a thief testing a lock, watching their patterns, learning the edges of their lives. Their posts were loud with laughter and sunlight. Their photos of cocktails and sunsets were knives in my chest. I learned the cruise name, the ship's itinerary, the exact day they left. I called the cruise line under a false pretense and asked about group bookings and cancellation policies. I studied the pier maps and memorized the nearby parking lots and shuttle schedules. I drove past their house late at night and early morning to see who really lived in that perfectly trimmed lawn. I listened to Mom at the diner as she bragged about new dresses and friends who helped with the trip. I wrote it all down in a small spiral notebook, dates, receipts, offhand comments, until the notebook felt heavy in my bag. Each new detail sharpened the shape of my plan. Anger had grown patient. Revenge needed patience too. Then I started to undo the safety nets they leaned on. I learned which cable company serviced their street and how their automatic payments were arranged. I called pretending to be a confused account holder and found out the name tied to their online profile. I mailed a letter to a forwarding address and watched how they didn't notice it for days. I opened a difficult conversation with the bank using careful language and discovered a small oversight in a bill they assumed paid. I didn't break anything yet. I simply nudged little stones under their feet and waited to see how they stumbled. My life had been a series of compromises, so I became surgical in my approach. I set up a quiet PayPal account and moved pennies at first, nothing suspicious, just to test their reaction. When I saw they didn't notice, my confidence grew. I was learning how invisible they'd made me. At work, I started saving in a new way. I'd take extra shifts and put the cash in envelopes, not to give them, but to buy tools for what I planned. I began meeting with an old friend named Naya, who ran a small legal aid office. Naya had a soft voice, but a mind like a lockpick. She taught me how to read contracts and where families often hid liabilities. She told me about eroding rights and about how the law favors those who prepare. We sat in her back office under a humming fluorescent light and pored over documents while I told her my story in pieces. I felt foolish at first. How could legal papers fix 20 years of bruises? Yet Naya showed me small, legal levers that could make them account for what they'd taken. For the first time since I was a child, someone asked what I wanted, and it was a strange, dizzying question. I rehearsed conversations like an actress learning lines. I called my mother to ask polite, ordinary things. How she liked the cruise, how the weather was, whether Dad had packed his blue sweater. I let her talk and float on the surface talk she loved. I kept my voice steady and calm. On another call, I said I'd forgotten to include a receipt and asked if she could resend a dinner photo as proof of a charge. When she obligingly texted a bright shot of their table, I saved it, timestamp and all. These small confirmations were fuel. Each, okay, and sent, made my ledger fatter. When she said, "You should have come," I didn't answer her guilt. I cataloged her guilt the way she'd cataloged my obedience. I wanted them to feel seen, but not with the soft warmth they'd always used against me. I wanted a sharp, public clarity that could not be ignored or softened by sweet talk. I found an ally in a neighbor named Royce who worked at the municipal lot near the cruise terminal. Royce owed me nothing. He liked truth the way some people like coffee, straight and black. I met him with a smile and a pie I'd baked, and he traded me information for stories. He told me about security cameras, shift changes, and how often people left lights on in cars. I offered him a modest amount to watch a license plate number on a particular weekend. Royce didn't ask why. He asked only for the right day and time, and then showed up like a reliable hinge. When he texted me the plate number and a short video clip of their vehicle leaving the driveway, I felt a cold satisfaction I hadn't known I could feel. The clip was small, grainy, and perfect. It tied a loose thread into a firm knot. My plan was no longer smoke and anger. It had a spine. At night, I practiced patience. I called the cruise line back, not to harass, but to change the records just enough to create a chain reaction. I knew bureaucracy loved neat paper trails, and that carefully placed falsehoods could derail a trip more effectively than a shouted argument. I wasn't seeking violence. I wanted embarrassment, accountability, the slow tightening of a rope around complacency. I set up meetings at the local courthouse to ask general questions about family claims and financial mismanagement. I took notes during those meetings and learned the exact forms needed to request a financial inquiry. I wasn't naive. I understood the law moved slowly, but I liked the idea of the system moving with steady, cold machinery while my parents' celebration dissolved in real time. Then I tested the emotional valves. I sent Elise a picture of Dad's favorite jacket with a note that said, "Saw this for sale, thought of him." Elise replied with a heart emoji and a thank you. I messaged Mark about a minor car repair and watched him answer quickly, eager to prove he was dependable. They moved like puppets on strings I had learned to find. I never accused them. I only reminded them of small things that nudged their conscience and watched what happened. Their small, guilty ticks built a map of who would respond and who would retreat. The map showed me where their loyalty lived and where fear lived. Fear is a useful thing when wielded carefully. It clarifies truth in a way compliments never will. As I tightened the threads, it became a game of exposure. I arranged for a shy auditor at the bank to look at a shared account marked as family savings. I submitted a formal question about irregular withdrawals under a consumer protection provision. The bank called me, politely puzzled, and I gave them the dates and receipts I'd gathered from their vacation posts. I did not shout. I did not threaten. I simply asked, "Can you help me understand these charges?" The bank's response was a tiny, bureaucratic snowball that would become an avalanche. I felt guilty, and then fierce, and then strangely proud. My parents always believed I lacked backbone. I had not lacked backbone. My backbone had been reassigned to carry everyone else's weight. Now it straightened. The day the bank called with a routine request to verify unusual activity, Mom answered and said, "It's nothing. The kids helped." Her voice was a practiced casualness. I sat at the kitchen table in my small apartment and felt the old familiar ache of wanting to be believed. But this time I did not flinch. I printed the emails, the timestamps, the screenshots the clip Royce had sent, and the notes from Naya about legal next steps. I walked to the courthouse with a folder that felt heavier than any suitcase I'd ever carried. My hands trembled only once, and then I steadied them because trembling had not helped me before. I had decided that the truth, when served plain and public, would sting harder than any quiet confrontation. I wanted them to watch the paper evidence and feel the same hollow victory they'd always taken. On the day I filed a formal inquiry, I felt like a woman stepping onto a stage she had built. The clerk smiled with the small practice smile of someone who sees too many broken families and tired fights. I signed forms in blue ink and handed over copies of messages, pictures, and logs. I watched the clerk stamp the forms, and the sound was a small, sacred percussion. For the first time in my life, I saw the possibility of a consequence that did not require me to shout or grovel. The consequences could be quiet, bureaucratic, and fair. They could also be public. My revenge was not a scream. It was a ledger opened before neutral eyes. As I left the courthouse, my palms felt empty and clean. The plan was in motion, and I had to wait for it to work. Nothing about this would be quick, but it would be inevitable. I walked past their house like a ghost that knew where all the shadows hid. From the street, everything looked the same: white porch columns, a mailbox with Mr. Wexler's brass flag, the swing that always squeaked in the wind, but when I slowed the car and watched, the motion inside felt different. Dad mowed at a pace that was too careful, as if trimming the lawn might wipe away proof. Mom sat on the step with a phone in her hand, scrolling through messages, as if counting receipts might calm her. I parked further down and watched the curtains move, timing the casualness of their gestures. It was strange to realize how often I had mistaken performance for reality. People rehearse calm the same way they rehearse grief, and only when you watch the rehearsal enough do you learn the real lines. The house exhaled when I left, and I felt the small, fierce thrill of having put a toe inside their private weather. The coil of my plan tightened, small and unbroken, and I knew I had to hold my face like steady stone until the time to move came. The town reacted in the slow, curious rhythm of places that know each other by first names and old grudges. At the diner, customers slid into booths and watched me in half glances, their gossip quieted by coffee steam. I'd always been the steady person at that counter, the woman who took orders with both hands, and no complaint, but the ledger I'd opened made my steadiness look different to everyone else. People who used to joke about my long-suffering nature now offered awkward sympathies. A local reporter called with cautious interest, and I gave a short, measured answer. I'm asking questions. That's all. The reporter wanted spectacle, a crying breakdown, a scandal wrapped in shouting. I gave him only the slow, legal truth and a quiet face. It annoyed him, but it served me. Meanwhile, whispers in the grocery store and half smiles at the post office told me my parents' performance was fraying. They were trying to stitch a new script with old threads, but the stitches did not hold when the world tugged. I kept my eyes forward, careful not to let the flicker of vindication show. I had learned that the people who build sensational stories want drama, but revenge that tastes like justice needs patience, not applause. Mom moved differently after the bank's first formal request arrived. She softened like bread left too long in the sun, edges gone, the center vulnerable. Once she was all practiced composure. Now she bit the inside of her cheek when no one watched, and she stopped telling the little lies that had always smoothed over the edges. She called me twice in one day, voice small and thin as tissue paper. "Can we meet?" she asked. The ask was both a trap and a test. I said yes and chose the place, the library's small community room, neutral air and clean light. When she sat down across from me, she folded her hands and pretended to be fragile the way actors pretend to sleep. "We were careless," she said. "It wasn't planned to hurt you." Her eyes searched mine like someone looking for a password. I'd heard that confession 1,000 times in different shapes, guilt sold by the ounce, and yet there was a tremor under it that felt real. I watched her, cataloging micro-expressions, the way her fingers flexed when a certain line of thought touched her. If apologies are currency, she was offering me pennies. I accepted her words only as data. Her confession might soften neighbors, but it did not erase ledgers. The legal request still hummed in my bag like a small instrument ready to play. Mark and Elise tried to be small and decent in different ways. Mark sent photos of his truck with the caption, "Working to make things right," and Elise posted a sunset with the words, "Family first." Their social media was a quiet parade of contrition and manufactured intimacy. I knew how to read the thin pages of public performance. Their words were scaffolding, not structure. I wrote them back brief messages. Thanks, noted, and then stopped answering longer explanations. When people lean on you for money and then offer public apologies, they expect the comfort of an audience. I refused the show. Instead, I focused on paperwork, on the small, dry boxes of evidence that legal systems prefer. Naya sat with me on my couch, surrounded by stacks of printouts and a laptop, and together we built a chronological story from scattered receipts and timestamps. Knowing how to arrange the pieces in the right order felt like composing a melody. The right arrangement would make the tune unavoidable. She taught me to speak to the bank with law's cold grammar, to name things plainly: unauthorized transfers, misrepresentation, accounting irregularities. Saying the words anchored them, and each utterance made the past heavier and harder to deny. There are moments when a plan requires gentleness masked as cruelty. I needed Mom to trust me enough to slip, to make mistakes so the record would catch them. I let her think I remained human, that I was open to reconciliation. When she invited me to a family meal, I accepted with a neutral tone and a head full of strategy. The table was set with the small, familiar arrangements she always made: candles slightly crooked, a salad in a bowl that had seen better days. I sat there and let her talk, letting the conversation drift to weather and neighbors, watching for slips. She laughed too, loudly once, and knocked over a glass, and her hand where the wine had spilled moved as if to hide a crumpled receipt in her lap. That single clumsy motion, a glance toward her purse, a thumb tucked under a bill, was all I needed. Later, when I asked about that receipt, she flinched and stammered. I did not challenge her in that moment. Instead, I collected her hesitation and stored it. In fraud's slow arithmetic, guilt is often expressed in inadvertent gestures. It's hard to feign a nervous twitch convincingly enough to fool a ledger or a trained clerk. The bank's machinery began to show its teeth in small, official clicks: requests for notarized documents, a demand for original receipts, an appointment set with a compliance officer. Each bureaucratic step felt like a small victory, but bureaucracies also demand patience and precision. One wrong signature, one misplaced form, and months of careful planning could be delayed. Naya and I double-checked everything like librarians restoring fragile books. We traveled to the cruise line office with a manila folder thick with dates and screenshots and spoke to a representative who looked over our evidence with the indifferent professionalism of someone who receives many small tragedies. She scanned images, typed notes, and promised to forward our inquiry to a claims department. It felt anticlimactic and monumental at once. These slow gears turned underground, invisible and patient, grinding toward a result that would expose a story my parents had tried to keep private. Neighbors began to act like weather patterns changing before a storm. Mrs. Keller from across the street brought over a pie and refused to look me in the eye. She said she admired my courage while her hands trembled and her mouth formed the careful vowels of someone striving not to offend either side. Teenagers who once dared each other to ring the Wexler doorbell now crossed at the other end of the block when I appeared. The town's gossip network shifted like a flock sensing a predator. I felt the change around me as if the air had thickened, solid, watchful, waiting. A former coworker, Luis, offered me a spare key to a small storage unit at a discount, just in case, he said, like an ally offering armor. I placed the folder of evidence in that unit at night, sliding the key into my pocket like a talisman, protecting the proof from the small, mundane risks of life. Loss, spill, forgetfulness felt sacred. The evidence had become both sword and shield, and I treated it with reverence. At times, the middle ground is the most dangerous place to stand. That week, I received a call from my father that sounded like an old record, blustery, embarrassed, pretending that everything was fine. "Karina, we'd like to come by, talk through this," he said, His voice was a practiced fog of bravado. I told him to come and that we would speak where it was public at the town hall in a place where words would have witnesses. He hesitated and then agreed. I knew what public spaces do. They pull performance into the light and make lies shrink. I prepared notes and practiced calm tones. Revenge had to be the kind tempered by purpose. I wanted accountability that could stand on paper and be repeated in neutral rooms. The day we would speak, there would be one of the teeth of my plan. It would be a test of courage for both of them and for me. As the day of the hearing approached, I slept poorly and woke with plans in my head. Night dreams mixed with checklist items, notary stamps, transcript questions, who would bring what documents. I found myself thinking of simpler things too, my childhood songs, the way Dad used to hum while he tightened a lawnmower spark plug. Those memories were sharp and tender and maddening. They reminded me that the people I was exposing had once been my entire world, cozy and flawed. It was complicated to want justice and still ache for what had been good. I let myself hold both feelings without resolving them. Anger and nostalgia can live together if you let them. They make a complicated fuel that keeps you alive during long struggles. The night before the hearing, I sat in my small kitchen with the folder, a cup of cooling tea, and a pen. I wrote a statement that wasn't meant for the bank or the court, but for myself. I will be steady. I will speak plain truth. I will not become the person I am trying to hold to account. The sentence felt like a vow. Promises to ourselves are muscles we must exercise. I folded the paper and slid it into the folder beside the receipts. When I closed the drawer, the house felt less hollow than it had months before. The plan was no longer a private thing humming in my head. It was a living sequence of actions and people and documents that would either make them answer or let them continue. I had crossed a threshold where I could no longer pretend to be small. The next day would bring witnesses, formal questions, and the risk that everything might still slip between fingers. I slept with my hand on the folder, feeling its small, stubborn weight, and woke ready to make the town watch the truth unspool. I stood in the town hall doorway with my folder clutched to my chest like a talisman, and the room felt both enormous and intimate. Rows of plastic chairs, fluorescent lights humming, a podium that looked like a stage for small confessions. People trickled in, neighbors with careful faces, a reporter with a camera tucked in his bag, my father in a jacket that smelled faintly of cologne and denial. Mom arrived last, breathless, smoothing her dress as if she could press the truth flat with fingers. My hands didn't shake when I walked to the front. The training I'd given myself in small, quiet rehearsals held. Naya sat in the second row, an unfussy anchor, and Royce lingered near the doorway with the easy posture of someone who keeps watch. I felt a strange peace that belonged to people who have decided to stop doing the forgiving for other people's mistakes. The clerk called us forward, and the room hushed like a fishbowl, ready to be stirred. When I set my folder on the podium, the paper made a small, weighty sound, and I realized how long I had been carrying that weight inside me, invisible and raw. This was the first time I would show it in public. I read my statement slowly, each word clear and measured, because I wanted the simple truth to land hard without melodrama. I described transfers and timestamps, the cruise photos, the casual text messages that admitted things in the soft glow of vacation filters. I said the words I had whispered to myself for years out loud. Unauthorized withdrawals, misrepresentation, emotional manipulation. When I spoke about my childhood, about the talent show dress, and the nights I gave up college money, I didn't hunt for pity. I told it precisely, like a ledger entry, because the ledger had been my teacher. Eyes moved in the room, some wet, some skeptical, some bored. Mom's face was a strange map of things. At first blank, then tightening, then flushing with a color that looked like regret or performance. Sometimes I could hardly tell. My father's jaw worked under his skin like a man chewing on a bitter memory he'd rather swallow whole. The clerk took notes with a mechanical politeness, and the reporter's pen scratched faster, hungry for a quote. When I finished, silence folded over us a while, thick as wool. Then a small sound, a cough, a chair scraping, broke the spell, and the businesslike rhythm of inquiry began. The bank's compliance officer asked pointed, polite questions. Dates, amounts, proof. I handed over screenshots and receipts, and the tiny video Royce had captured of their car, leaving the driveway. Each piece of paper slid across the table with a slow finality. I answered in the calm voice I had practiced at home, the one that would not let tears make me plead. The officer nodded and promised an internal review, and though the words sounded like bureaucracy, they carried a weight. This was not just a family argument anymore. It was a flagged pattern. Outside, the reporter's camera clicked, and someone whispered the word scandal like a promise. I felt both relieved and guilty, as if I'd opened a window and let the town see our dust. But I would not take it back. I had chosen consequence over silence, and there was no turning back. After the hearing, Mom came to me with hands spread like a child, voice small and faltering. "Karina, please," she said, and the words that followed leaned on guilt like scaffolding. "We never wanted to hurt you. We thought you'd understand." I looked at her the way I would examine a thrifted dress, for the seams, the repairs, the hidden stains. There were apologies in her hands, sure, but also excuses in her mouth. I thought of all the times she'd used soft language to make sharp things easier to swallow. "I understand," I said in a voice that felt flat and final. "I understand exactly." Her face crumpled like tissue. For a moment, I wanted to reach across the table and pat the brake to be the daughter she'd always wanted in the photograph, but the ledger was on the table, and my hands stayed folded. I had fought to make her see, not to soothe her. The town had seen now, too, and that publicness would not let the old patterns slide into polite oblivion. The fallout came in slow, mean waves. The bank froze a number of accounts for investigation. Mom and Dad found themselves answering questions on the phone with people who did not owe them neighborly kindness. A few neighbors stopped by with awkward casseroles and long measured sentences. Others closed their doors faster when our car passed by. Mark and Elise tried to do damage control. Mark called to promise to fix things, and Elise posted another family photo with the caption, "Working on it." Public contrition looked thin when tested against hard receipts. The story started to appear in quiet threads on the town's social feed, and I watched the comments like someone reading weather reports, predictions of storms, small pats on the head for me, doubts cast like pebbles. The reporter's article landed with a small, efficient headline that took the center lane of our small drama and ran with it. In the print world of our town, there was no hiding, rumors folded into facts, once typed on paper. One morning, a letter arrived that was neither official nor neighborly, a lawyer's letter from a firm in the county seat, terse and practiced, warning that if I continued to pursue this public course, they might seek damages for defamation and emotional distress. I read the letter twice, once for the legalese, and once for the undercurrent. They wanted to scare me into silence. I took a deep breath and called Naya. Her voice on the other end was cool and steady. "They're rattling a cage," she said. "When they're desperate, they try to scare. We respond with documents, not threats." She told me to forward the letter, to let the lawyer's words become part of the record instead of a private menace. I slept badly the night after, thinking of how the people who had fed me crumbs now tried to file their own pain in envelopes. But fear was an old friend. I knew its shape now. We would answer with evidence. Then something unexpected happened. A woman from my grade school, June Black, who'd once stood in my kitchen helping with casserole dishes when I was a girl, came to the diner and sat down across from me with a paper bag of my favorite raspberry tarts. She had a face mapped with years and a voice like a gentle creek. "I remembered when your mom made you sing at the talent show," she said, and I felt the world tilt slightly, not with spectacle, but with witness. People began to share small, private stories, who had seen me sew a dress, who remembered handing me a bus pass, who had overheard mom's offhand remarks about money. Memory is a force when gathered. It builds a structure that cold numbers cannot entirely topple. June's kindness was both balm and blade. It reminded me that truth is not only in bank ledgers, but in lived memory. As the bank's investigation widened, so did my life's exposure. Old friends and exes called to see if I was okay, and my inbox filled with messages, congratulations and cautionary notes. My ex-husband Carter texted, voice threadbare, "I'm sorry." My first instinct was to keep him at the edges, but when he came in one afternoon with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and a sorry that seemed to mean it, I realized something else was changing. People who had taken my giving for granted were beginning to see what my giving had cost me. Some offered help, legal advice, small loans to keep my paperwork copies safe, allies who passed on phrases like class action and consumer rights. I felt oddly buoyed by it, like someone discovering an unexpected current in a slow river. The current could carry me forward or swamp me, but at least it moved. But revenge, I discovered, is not a single act. It's a landscape walked carefully, where the paths you choose change who you become. There were nights I sat and wondered whether I had become the kind of person who relished other people's public shame. I worried that in seeking to make them accountable, I might harden into someone like them, someone who used sharp words when softer ones would have mended the roof. The thought made my stomach ache. At the same time, I knew that some roofs were rotten beneath the tiles and needed to be torn off so that light could reach the beams. Accountability was not cruelty. It was repair. I told myself that over and over like a prayer. Just when I thought the slow machinery of justice would preserve the status quo, a new voice entered the public thread. An anonymous tip to the county inspector about unpaid property taxes linked to a family trust. The tip was precise, cruel, and impeccable in timing. It landed like a second stone in a quiet pond, sending concentric waves outward. I did not know who had forwarded it or why, and my folder of evidence suddenly felt both prophetic and small. The inspector's office called, asking if anyone had noticed oddities in financial reporting. My heart thudded in my chest with a cold drum beat. Whatever happened next would not be just about missing change in a bank. It would be about long-standing choices and the consequences of living small lives that hid large privileges. I realized then that my plan, which had once been personal and precise, was turning into something larger than me. I had wanted them to answer to the ledger. Now they might have to answer to the law. The door of the town hall felt behind me like a hinge, and the hallway beyond stretched into questions I had not fully imagined. The call from the inspector's office came on a Thursday morning while I was pouring coffee into a chipped mug that had outlasted 3 jobs and 1 marriage. The woman on the line spoke in a voice stripped of emotion, explaining that they had discovered inconsistencies in the trust accounts and needed clarification. I sat down hard at the kitchen table, the wood cool beneath my palm, and felt the moment split into 2 clear halves, before and after. Before, I had been the dutiful daughter turned whistleblower. After, I was something else, tethered to a larger process I couldn't stop. My parents had never believed anyone beyond the family would care about what they did behind closed doors. Now, the state itself was asking questions. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt like the truth had finally stretched long enough to reach them, and there was no place left for them to hide. My father called that evening, voice tighter than I'd ever heard. He accused me of betrayal, of airing private matters in public, of siding with strangers over blood. The words clattered down the line, like coins falling into a tin cup, hollow and desperate. I didn't interrupt him. I let the anger flow until he finally ran out of breath. Then I said, evenly, you spent my money. You lied. You thought it wouldn't matter. Now it does. Silence stretched, thick and unbroken, before he muttered something about lawyers and hung up. The emptiness afterward was not relief. It was a sobering recognition that there would be no reconciliation, no sudden apology or tearful embrace. They had chosen their side, and I had chosen mine. Blood was no longer the shield it used to be. The community grew, restless as news trickled out. At the diner, I overheard whispers that mixed sympathy with suspicion. Some thought I was brave, others thought I had gone too far. A few even suggested I had fabricated everything to get attention. It stung, but I knew whispers would always cling to stories that challenged the picture-perfect families of small towns. What surprised me was how many people quietly offered support. An old teacher who pressed a $20 bill into my palm, a neighbor who slipped a note under my door that read, "Keep going, some of us see." These gestures stitched together a fragile net beneath me when I hadn't realized I needed. For years, I had carried everything alone, convinced no one would stand with me. Now, I saw that even small kindnesses could steady me when the walls of doubt pressed in. Royce noticed the strain on my face and invited me to take a walk by the river, where the evening light turned the water into a silver ribbon. He didn't push for words, just kept pace beside me, his hands in his pockets, his presence enough. Finally, I admitted what scared me most, not the legal fight, not even losing my parents for good, but the possibility that I was becoming someone hardened beyond repair. "I don't want to lose myself in this," I whispered. Royce stopped, looked at me with steady eyes, and said, "You're not. You're showing them you matter. That's not hardness, it's truth." The words sank deep, quiet but firm, like anchors in soft ground. For the first time in weeks, I slept without waking in the dark, gasping. His certainty gave me room to breathe, even if only for a night. As the investigation deepened, my parents' house turned into a fortress. Curtains stayed drawn, and neighbors said deliveries came at odd hours. Mom stopped attending church. Dad skipped community meetings, and their absence echoed louder than any accusation. Once I drove past and saw Mom through the window, her hair uncombed, staring blankly at the television. For a moment, guilt rose in me like a tide, threatening to wash away everything I had built. But then I remembered the ledger, the dress, the cruise photos. Guilt had been their tool, the chain they wrapped around me for decades. I couldn't let it tighten again. I pressed my foot to the gas and kept driving. The house shrinking in the rearview mirror like a memory I was determined not to live in anymore. But late one night, as I sat sorting papers, I felt something unexpected, an ache for the childhood I had never truly had. Not for the parents I knew, but for the parents I had wanted them to be. The longing was raw, almost unbearable, and it made me realize how deep the wound went. Revenge had been my weapon, but grief was the shadow I couldn't outrun. I let myself cry, not the sharp sobs of anger, but the heavy tears of mourning. I wasn't just destroying their illusion. I was burying the hope that someday they would change. That night, I finally understood that my fight wasn't only about money or justice. It was about reclaiming myself from the ruins of their choices. And with that clarity came resolve. The road ahead would be brutal, but for the first time, it was mine to walk. The official hearing was set in a windowless government building that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. I sat at the long wooden table with my stack of documents, my hands trembling only slightly as the clerk called our names. My parents shuffled in behind their lawyer, both of them looking smaller than I remembered. Dad's once commanding shoulders hunched forward, and Mom's face was drawn tight, lips pressed together in a thin line. The sight stirred something I hadn't expected, pity, but I forced it down. This wasn't the time to let old instincts soften me. The judge adjusted his glasses, glanced at the file, and asked the first question. In that sterile room, the years of deception, of guilt twisted into love, were finally laid bare. Each page of evidence felt like peeling back layers of a wound that had festered too long. When it was my turn to speak, my voice wavered at first, but steadied as I described how the money was taken, how the lies piled up, how I was treated like a stranger in my own family. Their lawyer objected more than once, calling my words exaggerations, but the judge overruled him, asking me to continue. I glanced once at my mother. Her eyes darted away, shame flickering there for just a moment before her mask returned. My father clenched his fists on the table, a man so desperate to keep control that he didn't realize he had already lost it. Each sentence I spoke loosened the weight on my chest, and by the time I finished, the silence in the room was thick. I wasn't sure if I'd won, but I knew I had been heard, and that alone was more than I had once believed possible. Outside the building, reporters lingered, sniffing out scandal in a small-town family feud. Microphones stretched toward me, questions hurled faster than I could answer. Why turn against your own parents? Do you regret exposing them? What happens next? I pushed through without responding, the cameras clicking like insects in the heat. It was strange, being the center of attention after years of invisibility. Strangers wanted to dissect my pain, to turn it into spectacle. I kept walking, clutching my bag, tightly, aware that every step I took was being recorded. Part of me wanted to scream, to shout that they didn't understand, but another part recognized the power of this moment. The story was out now, and it couldn't be stuffed back into silence. That evening, I returned home to find 2 envelopes slipped under my door. The first was a typed letter from someone anonymous, dripping with cruelty. It accused me of being ungrateful, of tearing apart a family for money, of being a disgrace. The words stung even though I knew they were poisoned lies. The second envelope, smaller and handwritten, contained only a short message. You are braver than most. Don't stop. That contrast, venom and kindness in the same moment, captured everything I was living through. My fight had split the world around me into those who despised me and those who quietly cheered me on. It was a reminder that truth never comes without cost, but also never without allies. Royce came by with takeout and found me sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers. He didn't ask what was in the letters. He didn't need to. Instead, he handed me a container of noodles, sat beside me, and let the silence settle until I was ready to speak. I told him about the hate, about how sometimes it was louder in my head than the support. He leaned back against the wall and said, "Noise is temporary. Truth lasts." The simplicity of his words cut through the fog of fear. In that moment, I realized how much I had changed. Once, I would have folded under my parents' disappointment, silenced myself to keep peace. Now, I was learning to stand tall, even when the wind howled around me. The community's division grew sharper as the case moved forward. Old friends of my parents crossed the street to avoid me, while others began confiding their own stories of betrayal, stories they had buried for years. It struck me how many people lived with hidden wounds, convinced no one would believe them. My story had cracked something open in them. Some nights I lay awake wondering if that alone was worth the pain, if by speaking I had given others permission to speak too. That thought steadied me. I hadn't asked for this role, but maybe it had been waiting for someone, and somehow it had landed on me. What once felt like punishment was beginning to feel like purpose. But as the trial date approached, the cost pressed harder. My phone rang less, my coworkers whispered more, and my parents' lawyer tried to smear me as unstable. The pressure built like storm clouds, and I felt the tension in my chest each morning before my feet even touched the ground. Still, I gathered myself, one breath at a time, one step after another. I had walked too far to turn back now. The revenge I had unleashed was no longer just about payback. It was about rewriting the story of who I was. And even though the world outside looked gray and uncertain, I knew deep down that the next chapter would either break me completely or free me for good. The trial began on a damp Monday morning, the kind of day where the air itself felt heavy with anticipation. I sat in the courtroom, my palms sweating against the smooth surface of the table, staring at the seal of justice carved into the wall behind the judge. My parents sat across from me, flanked by their attorney, their faces pale and stiff. For years, they had been the towering figures of my world, the ones I was meant to obey without question. But here, in this solemn chamber, stripped of authority, they looked almost small. It was strange, disorienting, to see the power shift like that. The clerk called the court to order, and as the gavel struck, the sound echoed in my chest, a signal that everything was about to change. The prosecution laid out the case methodically, presenting financial statements, receipts, and even witness accounts from family members who had known something was wrong but stayed silent. Each exhibit felt like a shard of glass cutting open old wounds. My parents' lawyer fought back, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial, painting me as an ungrateful daughter who had misunderstood sacrifices made on my behalf. The narrative twisted like barbed wire, but I held my ground. When I was called to the stand, the courtroom seemed to shrink, the stares of strangers boring into me as I took the oath. My voice trembled as I began, but steadiness came with each sentence. I wasn't just speaking for myself anymore. I was speaking for every version of me that had been silenced over the years. I described the day I gave them the money, how I thought it was for my father's medical bills, and the gut punch of discovering they had used it for a lavish cruise without me. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. And I saw my mother shift uncomfortably, her eyes darting down. My father's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists on the table. Their lawyer objected, calling it irrelevant to the financial charges, but the judge overruled. It speaks to motive, the judge said, his voice calm but firm. That validation filled me with a heat I hadn't felt before, like a fire stoked after years of cold neglect. For the first time, my truth wasn't just whispered in the dark, it was amplified, undeniable, carved into the record of law. The cross-examination was brutal. Their lawyer tried to tear me apart, questioning my memory, my character, even my sanity. He implied I was bitter, jealous, seeking revenge for childhood slights. Each question was a dagger meant to make me stumble, but I remembered Royce's words, "Noise is temporary. Truth lasts." So I answered calmly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact. The more he tried to paint me as unstable, the more the truth shone through. I saw it in the jurors' faces, the way their expressions softened, the way their eyes lingered on me. They weren't seeing a vengeful daughter anymore. They were seeing someone betrayed, someone who had given everything and been left empty. That realization fueled me, gave me strength to push through the storm of accusations. When my parents took the stand, the shift in the room was palpable. My father spoke first, his voice steady but cold. He claimed the money had been a gift, that I had offered it willingly, and that I was twisting the narrative out of resentment. My mother followed, her tone sharper, almost venomous. She painted herself as the martyr, insisting she had endured a lifetime of sacrifice only to be repaid with cruelty. But cracks showed in their stories, small contradictions, moments where the mask slipped. The prosecution pounced on those slips, unraveling their narrative piece by piece. It was painful to watch, but necessary. For years, they had held the power of truth over me. Now, it was unraveling before their eyes, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Outside the courthouse, whispers spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now nodded in quiet solidarity. Articles appeared online, some condemning me as selfish, others praising me for my courage. The attention was overwhelming, yet I clung to the thought that my story mattered. Royce kept me grounded, reminding me that no headline could define me. Still, the emotional toll was relentless. Nights became harder, sleep a distant luxury, and the weight of what I had set in motion bore down on me. Yet, even in exhaustion, I knew I could never turn back. The truth had been spoken aloud, and like a bell rung, it could never be silenced again. As the days stretched into weeks, the trial became more than just a legal battle. It was a reckoning. Every detail unearthed was like shining a light into the corners of a long-abandoned house, revealing dust, rot, and things better left unseen. Witnesses testified, an aunt who had seen how my parents flaunted their wealth after claiming poverty, a cousin who recalled whispers of favoritism and manipulation. Each testimony felt like validation, but also like reopening old wounds. My parents' faces hardened with each blow, their silence in the courtroom deafening. At one point, I almost thought I saw my mother's eyes glisten with tears, but if they were there, they were gone in an instant, swallowed by her stubborn pride. The closing arguments were a storm of words. The prosecution painted a picture of betrayal, manipulation, and greed, reminding the jury of the paper trail, the testimonies, the deception. My parents' lawyer tried one last time to frame me as a bitter child, desperate for attention. But as I sat there, I realized something important. This trial wasn't about attention. It wasn't even just about money. It was about reclaiming the dignity they had stripped from me. The jury wasn't just deciding their fate. They were deciding whether truth mattered more than appearances. That thought carried me through the final moments as the courtroom quieted and the jury filed out to deliberate. The wait for the verdict stretched like a lifetime. Hours passed in silence, every tick of the clock louder than the last. I sat with my hands clasped tightly, staring at the floor while my parents whispered furiously with their lawyer. Royce squeezed my shoulder, grounding me in the present. When the jury finally returned, the room held its breath. The foreman stood, unfolding the paper with deliberate slowness. His voice was steady as he read the verdicts, each word like a stone dropping into still water, rippling outward. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse quicken, as the weight of years hung in the balance. Everything I had endured, the lies, the shame, the betrayal, was about to be judged, not just by strangers, but by truth itself. The gavel struck again, sealing the decision into history. My parents' faces crumpled, their masks shattered. For the first time, I saw them as they truly were, fallible, flawed, and defeated. The victory didn't feel like joy. It felt like release. A door that had been locked for years was finally opened, and though the room beyond was dark, at least it was mine to walk through. I breathed in deeply, letting the moment wash over me, knowing this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something new. As I left the courthouse, the sky broke open, rain pouring down in sheets. I tilted my face upward, letting it drench me, cleansing me, baptizing me into a life I had fought so hard to reclaim. I didn't sleep that night. The sound of the ocean waves outside my motel window was supposed to be calming, but it only reminded me of the trip my parents were enjoying without me. I pictured them clinking champagne glasses, laughing, and calling it the best time of their lives, while I was left behind. Rage burned inside me. I sacrificed everything for them, and they replaced me with strangers on their perfect vacation. My chest ached as I stared at the ceiling. The thought replayed over and over. They celebrated without me. I had never felt so betrayed, so cast aside by the very people who should have loved me the most. But as the hours dragged on and my anger boiled, a sharp, dangerous thought entered my mind. What if I didn't just sit here and cry? What if I turned this betrayal into their greatest regret? The next morning, I drove to the marina where the cruise ships docked. I knew their itinerary by heart because my father had bragged about every stop during our last phone call. He wanted me to know exactly what I was missing. That arrogance became my weapon. I walked past the rows of shiny cars parked by vacationers and felt my heart pounding. My plan wasn't just revenge. It was a lesson, a punishment they would never forget. I wasn't going to harm them physically, but I would strip away the one thing they valued above all else, comfort and pride. I thought of every bill I had paid, every dollar I had handed them, while skipping meals myself. That money funded this cruise. That money was supposed to save Dad's health. The betrayal sliced deeper than any knife. And now, they would learn what betrayal really felt like. I had nothing left to lose, but they did. I made a stop at a quiet cafe and sat by the window watching the tourists pass. My laptop hummed as I logged into my bank app. My hands shook, but my resolve didn't. They had added me as a co-signer for their accounts years ago when I helped manage their bills. They probably forgot, but I didn't. I saw every transaction, every meal, every drink, every gift shop purchase made with my money. They weren't just enjoying a cruise. They were living like royalty. My jaw clenched as I stared at the figures. Thousands gone. My future, my daughter's stability stolen to fund their fantasy. I opened the settings and with 3 simple clicks froze their cards. The power was intoxicating. I could almost hear their gasps when they'd try to swipe and be denied. My lips curved into a smile. This was only the beginning. They thought they had outsmarted me, but now I was the one pulling the strings. That night, I sat in my car overlooking the ocean. The cruise ship glowed in the distance, lights glittering like a floating city. My chest rose and fell with adrenaline as I imagined the moment they'd be embarrassed in front of everyone. My mother, demanding answers from a confused waiter. My father, fumbling with his wallet as people stared. They'd feel small. They'd feel powerless, just like they made me feel every time they dismissed my sacrifices. I almost pitied them, but then I remembered the picture my mother had posted on Facebook, her arm around a stranger, captioned, "Family is everything." Family, everything, except me, the daughter who gave up her life for them. That image carved away any lingering guilt. They replaced me. Now, I was replacing their joy with humiliation. A storm brewed in my heart, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. The following day, I couldn't resist checking updates from the cruise. Social media was my silent battlefield. I scrolled, looking for signs of chaos, and there it was, a vague post from one of the friends they'd invited. Crazy day at sea. Never thought we'd run into money problems like this. I laughed, loud, bitter, triumphant. I could almost taste their panic. My parents weren't the type to handle embarrassment well. They built their lives on appearances, on showing the world how perfect they were. For that mask to crack in such a public way, it was more powerful than any revenge I could have dreamed of. But I wasn't done. Freezing their money was just one strike. I had more planned. My revenge wasn't just about punishment. It was about control. They had stolen control of my life, and now I was taking it back, one calculated move at a time. I reached out to the cruise company under the guise of concerned family. I explained how my parents had been reckless with their spending, how they left unpaid debts piling up back home. I painted a picture of irresponsibility, of people who didn't deserve the luxury they flaunted. I knew companies guarded their image fiercely, and whispers of scandal could spread fast. My words were sharp, laced with enough truth to be believable. I didn't know how much damage it would cause, but I didn't care. I wanted their names associated with disgrace. When I hit send, my hands trembled, but not from fear, from exhilaration. They had cast me out of their celebration, but now their celebration was crumbling. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let out a breath I'd been holding for years. The scales were finally tipping in my favor. For days, I waited, balancing between dread and satisfaction. My daughter called me one evening, her voice curious. "Mom, why do Grandma and Grandpa keep trying to call? They sound upset." I swallowed hard, torn between the truth and silence. She didn't need to know everything, not yet. All I said was, "They're learning a lesson, sweetheart. One they should have learned a long time ago." My daughter's quiet laugh lifted me for a moment. She had seen me struggle, sacrifice, and cry over these people. Maybe she'd finally see me stand tall too. That thought gave me strength. Revenge wasn't just for me. It was for her, for showing her that betrayal doesn't go unanswered. No one should accept being treated like they don't matter, especially not by their own blood. My parents thought they could erase me from their lives, but I was proving that I was unforgettable. By the time the cruise neared its end, I had become addicted to the power. Every missed call, every frantic message from my mother fueled me. She begged me to talk, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. My father tried guilt, reminding me of times he took care of me as a child. But their words fell flat. Where was their care when I emptied my bank account for them? Where was their love when they toasted champagne? Without me. They wanted forgiveness, but what they really wanted was control back. And I wasn't giving it. The more they pleaded, the stronger I felt. For once, I wasn't their desperate daughter chasing scraps of affection. I was the storm they couldn't stop. And when the ship finally docked, I was waiting not with open arms, but with fire in my eyes. This wasn't reconciliation. This was reckoning. The day they stepped off the cruise, dragging their suitcases and forced smiles, I stood at the edge of the port. My heart raced, but I didn't hide. I wanted them to see me. My mother's face twisted in shock, my father's in shame. I didn't speak first. I let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, until my mother finally whispered, "What have you done?" Her voice cracked, fragile for the first time in my life. I met her gaze and said, "What you taught me." The words hung in the air like a blade. Their betrayal had cut me, but now my revenge cut deeper. I turned and walked away before they could answer. The weight on my shoulders felt lighter, but the fire inside me still burned. They thought they'd celebrated without me, but I had been with them the entire time, haunting, destroying, avenging, and this was only the beginning. When I walked away from them at the dock, I thought that would be the end. I thought leaving them in silence with their shame would be enough to seal the wound they had carved into me. But as I drove back home, the anger didn't fade. It twisted deeper, settling in my chest like a knot that refused to loosen. Part of me wanted closure, but another part demanded more. They had spent years taking from me, draining me dry, and replacing me with anyone who stroked their egos. Watching them stumble off that cruise ship was satisfying, yes, but it wasn't final. I realized then that revenge wasn't just a single act. It was a chain reaction. And now that the first domino had fallen, I had no intention of stopping. They needed to understand the real cost of betraying me. The days that followed were tense. My phone buzzed, constantly with calls and messages from my mother and father. They begged, threatened, and pleaded in cycles, as if shifting tones might sway me. But I didn't answer. I let them stew in silence. It was the same silence I had endured when I cried alone, begging for their recognition after every sacrifice. What they didn't realize was that silence is louder than words. It screams the truth no one wants to hear. My daughter noticed how quiet I had become too. She asked me if I was okay, and I told her I was finally standing up for myself. I think she understood, even if she didn't know every detail. For the first time, she saw me not as a victim, but as someone willing to fight back. That realization made the war I waged inside my family feel necessary, even righteous. Soon after, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't a card or an apology. It was a bill. My parents had tried to use their frozen accounts to settle debts and had failed, leaving unpaid balances tied to my cosign name. They thought I would step in, like always, and clean up their mess. But instead of panicking, I laughed. The irony was poetic. The very system they used to drain me was now choking them. I filed paperwork, cut every legal tie I had to their finances, and left them stranded in the swamp of their own making. When I signed those forms, I felt free in a way I hadn't in years. The chains broke, and the sound of them snapping echoed in my heart. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was liberation. And the look on their faces when they realized it would haunt them forever. I started hearing whispers from people in town. My parents had always carried themselves like pillars of the community, the perfect couple who everyone admired. But now, their reputation was unraveling. Stories spread about their money troubles on the cruise, the embarrassment they faced, and the strained relationship with their only daughter. I didn't have to fuel the gossip. Others did it for me. Every sideways glance, every hushed conversation at the grocery store was a dagger to their pride. And pride was what they loved most. Seeing them lose that facade was sweeter than any apology could ever be. For once, I wasn't the one being pitted. They were. People asked me what happened, and I just smiled and said, "They finally learned you can't take from someone forever without paying the price." My words became their curse, echoing through every circle they once controlled. But revenge has a way of stirring ghosts. As much as I celebrated their downfall, I couldn't escape the memories of what had led me here. I remembered nights of skipping meals so I could send them money. I remembered lying awake worrying about Dad's health bills, thinking my sacrifice might buy him time. I remembered the shame of telling my daughter we couldn't afford things because Grandma and Grandpa needed us more. Each memory stabbed me, but instead of breaking me, they fueled me. Those memories reminded me why I chose this path. People might call it cruel, but cruelty was what I endured for years in silence. Now, I was simply mirroring it back. Some might say two wrongs don't make a right, but in my world, revenge was the only language my parents understood, and I was fluent in it now. My mother finally showed up at my door. I'll never forget the look on her face. The confident woman I once knew was gone, replaced by someone fragile, desperate. She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back. Her words spilled out, apologies mixed with excuses, promises she would change. But I heard none of it. What I saw was the same woman who had left me behind while she toasted champagne with strangers. I asked her one question: if I hadn't taken revenge, would you have ever stopped? She froze, lips trembling, eyes wide. The silence that followed was my answer. She wouldn't have stopped. They never would have stopped. That realization hardened me further. I closed the door on her tears. It wasn't cruelty. It was justice. And justice meant protecting myself and my daughter from ever being used like that again. As time went on, their world continued to collapse. Their friends grew distant, unwilling to be tied to scandal. Their bills piled higher, with no one to bail them out. They tried rebuilding their image, but the cracks were too deep. I watched from afar, not with guilt, but with clarity. This was the cost of betrayal. Every moment they ignored me, every sacrifice they took for granted, had led them here. I didn't celebrate loudly. I didn't need to. My silence, my distance, was the sharpest weapon I could wield. And as their lives grew smaller, mine grew stronger. My daughter and I built new routines, new joys. We no longer lived in the shadow of their greed. Revenge wasn't just about tearing them down. It was about finally stepping into the light, free from the chains they had wrapped around me for so long. One evening, sitting with my daughter on the porch, I realized the storm inside me had finally settled. She leaned against me, her laughter filling the air as we watched the sunset. For the first time, I felt peace. Not because my parents suffered, but because I no longer carried their weight. I had given them everything, and in return, they had celebrated without me. But instead of letting that betrayal define me, I turned it into my strength. My daughter looked at me and said, "Mom, you're the strongest person I know." Tears welled in my eyes, not from pain, but from pride. Strength wasn't in suffering quietly, it was in refusing to be broken again. My parents might never understand that, but it didn't matter anymore. Their regret was their prison. My freedom was my victory, and I had finally claimed it, unapologetically. This is where my story ends, but the lesson lives on. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. It often comes from the people closest to us. But when that happens, you don't have to accept it. You don't have to keep bleeding for people who only take. Sometimes standing up for yourself means burning the bridges that lead back to pain. And sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. It's about reclamation. I reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my future. And while my parents sit in the ruins of their choices, I walk forward hand in hand with my daughter toward a brighter tomorrow. If you've ever been betrayed, know this. You have the power to rise, to fight, and to reclaim what's yours. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because no one deserves to suffer in silence.